to the entertainment Talking Sports.
What is going on, football fans? Back at it with another New York Giants video as the NFL draft is getting closer and closer. And I thought about this video when I woke up this morning because it's a common talking point that I hear all the time. And this video is not a pro offensive tackle video. It's not a pro Isaiah Simmons video. I pretty much said, I've been outspoken. I prefer the offensive tackle because we have the second-year quarterback. If the Giants feel one is an elite prospect. Of course, if you're picking a guy in the top 5, you better be an elite prospect. But I completely see the rationale behind taking Isaiah Simmons. Isaiah Simmons is a Pro Bowl level talent. The guy is going to be a great pro, in my opinion. I get some people, are scared about his size and how he could get off blocks. But overall, I think he's a perfect modern-day linebacker. I think he's very worthy of being a top 5 selection. But one talking point that I commonly hear from a lot of my subscribers is you can't take an offensive tackle. It's too early. The offensive tackles are not supposed to go in the first 5 picks. And I did some research. I looked over the last 8 drafts, and I'll be completely unbiased in this video. I'll tell you that you could certainly make an argument that some of those offensive tackles have not panned out. But I'll go over every position, and I'll show you guys that a lot of these positions have not panned out, if you're being completely fair and unbiased. To me, I think the most important thing is the New York Giants find a guy that fills one of their biggest needs. And you could certainly argue that a coverage linebacker is a huge need and a guy that's a versatile piece in this New York Giants defense, no doubt about it, with as bad of a defense as we've had. And I definitely think you can make an argument that we need an offensive tackle. We surrender the most pressures in football at the offensive tackle position. But I kind of wanted to speak out against that talking point that it's too early to take an offensive tackle. What I did was I looked at the last 8 drafts from 2012 to 2019, and I looked at the top 5 picks. And the offensive tackle was one of the more commonly drafted positions. But let's jump right into it, and we'll talk about how many of these positions were drafted in the top 5 and kind of the success rate. At the quarterback position, naturally, 11 of the 40 selections were quarterbacks, which makes up over 25% of the total draft pool. I think it works out to 27.5%. And when you look at the quarterbacks, some are going to be hits, some are going to be fails, and some of them are going to be way too early to tell. Kyler Murray, last year was the number 1 overall selection, had a good rookie year. In my opinion, still way too early to tell if he's going to be a success. Blake Bortles, there's a failure. Darnold has not gotten off to the hottest start of his career. Still, left up for interpretation, but certainly not trending in the right direction. Baker Mayfield had a strong rookie year, had a bad sophomore year, a very disappointing one. So far out of the first 4, none of them are slam dunks to be elite prospects. Mitch Trubisky might be getting replaced in Chicago, was a top 5 pick. He was a bust. Jared Goff made a Super Bowl. This year was disappointing, but I would definitely say he's at least an average starting quarterback in the NFL. Carson Wentz, if he could remain healthy, was definitely worthy of a top 5 selection. Jameis Winston is on his way out with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and Marcus Mariota is now a backup. So, of those quarterbacks, who, really was a slam dunk prospect out of some of the guys I've mentioned? Not a lot of them. Some of them I suppose are, but it's definitely not that it's like this high hit rate. And I get that the quarterback is the most important position, which is why it's drafted as commonly as it is. Now, the thing that I find ironic is that a lot of people that are speaking out against taking an offensive tackle in the top 5 want Isaiah Simmons. And by no means am I against taking Isaiah Simmons, and by no means do I think these people are wrong. I think there's an argument, like I always say, for both sides. But one of their common talking points is you can't take an offensive tackle in the top 5 picks. Do you know how many inside linebackers, which is the position that Isaiah Simmons would be getting drafted for? I get it that he plays a multitude of positions, but his other 2 common positions that I think he'd play in the NFL are safety and slot corner. 0 safeties and 0 slot corners have been selected in the top 5 picks over the last 8 drafts, and only 1 middle linebacker, and that middle linebacker was Devin White. Devin White, way too early to see how he will do. Guy I really liked. I was actually on record as saying that I would have not have minded the Giants taking him with the 6th overall selection had he fell. He went 5th to the Bucs. Next position we'll talk about is the running back position. New York Giants are one of the 4 teams that selected a running back. So 4 out of 40 picks, 10% of the last top 5 selections have been running backs. And that has, of course, been Ezekiel Elliott, Saquon Barkley, Trent Richardson, and Leonard Fournette. Richardson and Fournette, I think you could certainly make an argument were failures for where they were selected. Barkley and Zeke were probably hits. Of course, Barkley's got to stay healthy, but he certainly demonstrated he is one of the best running backs in football. So that's kind of a 50% hit rate. It's kind of similar to the quarterback. Quarterback, you could actually argue, was less than a 50% hit rate. Next, we're going to talk about is the defensive end. The defensive end, I've said many times, is the safest position to take in the top 5. All you got to do is go back and look at history. And like the quarterback position, a large amount of the picks in the top 5 over the last 8 drafts have been defensive ends, probably because of that and because it's such an important position. 10 out of the last 40 have been defensive ends, which makes up 25%. If you combine the quarterback and the defensive end position, 21 out of 40, more than 50%, have been between those two positions, and that's excluding the outside linebacker Khalil Mack, who makes up for another, only one outside linebacker has been in the top 5. So 22 have essentially been a pass rusher or a quarterback out of the last 40 top 5 picks. And of the defensive ends, you got both Bosa brothers, who I would say were successes. Clay and Farrell, who was a big reach and could easily be a failure. Chubb, who's pretty solid there with the Broncos. Garrett, we all know, is supremely talented when he's not smashing people over the head. Solomon Thomas, well, that looks to be somewhat of a bust. Dante Fowler had a nice rebound season last year. We'll see where that goes. Zeke Ansah, solid player. Deion Jordan. So there's been some hits, there's been some misses, but I would say it's one of the higher success rates. Then and again, I want to point out that and of course we talked about Khalil Mack. He's the lone outside linebacker. Again, I want to point out though that Isaiah Simmons is not an edge rusher. There's only one elite edge rusher in this class, and more than likely the New York Giants will not be getting him. But it's why I think Chase Young is the slam dunk pick of this draft. Next position we're going to talk about is the offensive tackle. And the offensive tackle, for all the people that say that it's too early to take one, is the third most commonly drafted position in the top 5 picks since 2012, after the edge rusher and the quarterback, defensive end and quarterback. Offensive tackle, there were 6 drafted out of the 40, which makes up for 15% or thereabouts. I think it is 15%, if I'm doing the math correctly off the top of my head, of the 40 overall selections. Now, some are hits like every other position, and some are misses. Now, there's no elite players. I'll be completely fair out of these players. 2 of the 6 offensive tackles won a Super Bowl, and 2 were complete failures. One, you could certainly argue, was a failure. And that is Brandon Scherff, who's solid, very, very solid offensive lineman, who was franchise tagged this year by the Washington Redskins. Greg Robinson did not work out. Eric Fisher was not worth the number 1 overall selection, but he's certainly been a guy that's been on that line year in and year out for the Kansas City Chiefs, was a Pro Bowler a year ago, and helped win a Super Bowl for the Chiefs this year, even though he only played in half the games. You could certainly argue maybe he's not worthy of that selection. Luke Joeckel was a failure. Lane Johnson, I would say, is definitely a hit. 3-time Pro Bowler, All-Pro, won a Super Bowl, and Matt Khalil made a Pro Bowl, but, kind of tailed off and was probably not worthy of it. So I think you could argue 3 out of the 6 were somewhat successful there with Brandon Scherff, Eric Fisher, and Lane Johnson. None of them were over the top. I would say Lane Johnson was the most successful, but much like a lot of these positions, who's your over-the-top quarterback? Carson Wentz? Carson Wentz had an injury. So I think it's just as risky as any other position, and it's the third most commonly drafted in the top 5 picks. Next position we'll talk about is the cornerback. Cornerback looks to be there may be a third added to this list, but there's only been 2 cornerbacks drafted in the top 5, and both were fairly successful. Denzel Ward, still way too early to tell, but Jalen Ramsey was definitely successful. And then the defensive tackle, well, that's Quinnen Williams, who did not look very good last year with the New York Jets, but he's still a player I definitely like. But there you have it. Defensive end and quarterback make up more than 50% of the top 5 picks over the last 8 years' drafts. Offensive tackle, which I continue to say is a very important position. You could certainly argue it's the second or third most important position after the quarterback, and probably defensive end was the third most. And it only makes sense. And then after that, the fourth most is actually the running back. I didn't even mention the wide receiver. There were a few wide receivers drafted as well. There were 4, that being Corey Davis, Amari Cooper, Sammy Watkins. I forgot to write down the 5th. So running back and wide receiver were actually the fourth most drafted position in the top 5 after the offensive tackle position. So there you have it. I just wanted to go over some of the success rate, some of the players, and kind of dispel the myth that it's way too early to take an offensive tackle. Now, to be completely fair, there has not been an offensive tackle taken in the top 5, I think, since 2016. Might have been 15, whatever it may have been. So in recent drafts, I suppose you could argue that, but there's only been 1 middle linebacker drafted over that course of time in the top 5. There's been no safeties. There's been no slot corners. So if you want to make the argument for Isaiah Simmons, make the argument that you think he's the best available talent. But the argument that it's too early to take an offensive tackle is completely invalid because outside of the quarterback and defensive end position, it's the most commonly drafted in the last 8 drafts combined in the top 5 picks. It's clearly a very valuable position. NFL teams realize that. And if one of these players are thought to be an elite prospect by the New York Giants, they could very well take him. The same could be said for Isaiah Simmons, even though there's only been one inside linebacker drafted over the last 8 drafts combined in the first 5 picks, 0 slot corners and 0 safeties. But sometimes guys like Saquon Barkley, some guys are too good to pass up, and Isaiah Simmons may be viewed that way by the New York Giants. But by the same token, maybe Andrew Thomas is at the offensive tackle position or Jedrick Wills. As always, guys, if you liked what you watched, please subscribe, drop a comment, maybe give me a little thumbs up. Cheers.